Ladies and gentlemen, moving on to our next session on the East India Company Rebellion and Revolt. Now, in this discussion, we will unravel the economic, political, and social ramifications of the East India Company's presence in India. Through this thought provoking dialogue, we unveil the enduring impact of this significant historical chapter, shedding light on the intricate complexities and transformations it brought to the Indian subcontinent. And to take this discussion forward, I already have with me Professor Peter Stanley, one of Australia's most distinguished military historians. Our other panelists, calling them on stage, Swapna Liddle, she's also an historian and an author. Please welcome both of them with a huge round of applause. And to moderate this session, we have Professor Anirudh Deshpande. He is Professor Modern History, Department of History, Faculty of Social Sciences at Delhi University.
I think we should start the session now. We have about an hour between us, and I'll give each of the speakers about 20 to 25 minutes. Is that enough?
More than enough.
More than enough. And both speakers have been introduced in the brochure you have, so there's no need for me to speak much about both these people who are distinguished scholars in their own right. Peter has written scores of books on various aspects of the Indian Armed Forces, Indian Army, in combat and in peace. He is a well-known social and cultural historian of the Indian Armed Forces, especially the colonial Indian Armed Forces. And I'm told his latest book is on the East India Company's army organization during the great Santhal uprising of 1856, the Santhal Hul. Am I right, Peter? More or less, yeah. So that's a good endorsement from him, being told that I'm more or less right. And Swapna's latest book is with me. It's on the first 50 years of Delhi. Delhi under the influence of the East India Company from 1803 to 1857. And this seems to be a very interesting book. Swapna is a well-known scholar of Delhi. She's done a number of books and articles on Delhi, and she's been working on these themes. She has worked on the sources. She's worked on Persian, Urdu, English sources of the period. And I'm lucky enough to have received a personal copy of this book about half an hour ago from her, and a book I look forward to. So I think we'll begin with Swapna. I think are we supposed to begin with you or Peter? Okay, we'll begin with Peter. And Peter, you got about 20, 25 minutes to present.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. And it's a particular pleasure to have a chair in Professor Deshpande. And I'm particularly privileged to share a platform with a scholar of the history of Delhi of the stature of Dr. Liddle. My PowerPoint's still coming up, so that's good. The subject of our session this afternoon is the East India Company, which of course dominated the history of India for 2 centuries. And the particular aspect of the East India Company's experience that I want to discuss this afternoon is the Santhal Rebellion of 1855. The Santhal Rebellion is known in general, in vague terms in India, and indeed almost nothing is known of it elsewhere. But there are only 2 books substantially on the Santhal Rebellion. And those 2 books basically deal with the rebellion as a cultural phenomenon. So I'm the first person to deal with it as, if you like, a military phenomenon. And as a rebellion, of course, it was an act of prolonged and intense violence. And so a military historian brings a particular perspective to that account. Next slide, please. As Anirudh mentioned, I'm a historian basically of Australia, and there's some of the books that I've published on Australia. So you'll understand that I'm not originally an Indian specialist, and I certainly am not a specialist in India itself. But, next slide please, I am a scholar of, as Anirudh also mentioned, the colonial period of India, and particularly the colonial armies. So as you'll see, I've done books on White Mutiny, which is about the European troops of the East India Company in the aftermath of the Great Rebellion of 1857-58, a book on Indians on Gallipoli, a book on terriers in India, which is British territorial soldiers in India in the Great War, and Hull Hull, which is the book I'll talk about today, and the one on the right, John Company's Armies, is my next book, which comes out next year, and it deals with the military forces of British India in the 33 years immediately preceding 1857. And the books on the bottom are the novels. I write novels as set in India as a hobby, so I'm steeped in that period. Next slide, please. What I want to talk about this morning is the Santhal Rebellion of 1855. The Santals are an indigenous, they're a tribal group who live in the bend of the Great Bend of the Ganges. You can see that the Ganges flows across the top of the screen and then down towards the Hooghly, Calcutta. And in the Rajmahal Hills, which is in the bend of the Ganges, the Santals had settled in the 50 years before 1855. At the end of the summer of 1855, under the influence of a charismatic group of brothers from a little village called Bugnadihi near Burheit in the Rajmahal Hills, the Santals broke into rebellion, completely unexpected by the company administration in Bengal. There's the covers of both the book, the British edition of Hull Hull, and the Indian edition of Hull Hull, which is sadly not available for sale downstairs. Oops. Next slide, please. Oh no, can I go back to the previous slide? Previous slide, please. You'll see where the circle on the map at the right is where the rebellion broke out in the Rajmahal Hills. And thousands of Santals burst out from the hills, and they went in all directions, north towards Bhagalpur, the district capital, towards the river to the east, and south towards the district of Birbhum. Completely unexpected. Why did they do this? Next slide, please. The Santals lived in villages all through the Rajmahal Hills. They basically lived a subsistence life. Their villages were small. They were small farmers. They were also massive. Next slide, please. They were massively exploited by the mostly Bengali landlords and merchants and moneylenders who imposed great imposts on them financially, impoverished them. And the Santal people made representations to the superintendent from the company official responsible for the area, the Damini Co., and begged him to relieve them of this burden. And the company officials basically ignored them, told them to go to law, which of course was impossible. Their frustration boiled over in the summer of 1855, and they began to murder landlords, merchants, Bengalis generally who lived among them, and the small Rajas and big Zemindars who lived in the area. Next slide, please. So the East India Company took it upon itself to respond by suppressing the rebellion. And the principal means to suppress this rebellion was the Bengal Army. Now, the Bengal Army, I think, has gone down in British Indian history as a rather decadent institution by this time, proved, of course, by the outbreak of the Great Mutiny in 1857. So its command was not particularly distinguished. On the top left there, you'll see the Governor-General, Lord Dalhousie, who treats the Commander-in-Chief, Sir William Gom, as a puppet. So command wasn't so good. The middle picture at the top, we know that the army was burdened by bureaucracy. There's a Babu with a great long list of records. Records that fortunately exist and enable us to reconstruct the rebellion in great detail. Of course, it's an army, so it's hierarchical. The bottom left, there's the chain of command right down from the general to the drummer boy. And there are the officers of the Bengal Army, the young subaltern, the middle-aged captain, and the elderly, jaded, faded major or colonel. So we have a picture of the Bengal Army as being a particularly decadent and rather useless institution. Of course, its main strength, top right, are the 74 regiments of the Bengal Native Infantry. And it's that force which is deployed to meet the rebellion. Next slide, please. The rebellion, the army mobilizes with remarkable rapidity. Troops, despite the monsoon, troops are sent out to confront these bands of Santals. And there are dozens of actions fought right across the Santal country to suppress the rebellion. The big picture is of a battle fought at Bisuhawa, which is, I can't find where that place is now. I think it's in Jharkhand, where the 40th Bengal Native Infantry confront Santals, and many Santals are killed, as they are in virtually every confrontation. I was able to find the actual battlefields of Mohishpur, 15th of July, which is in Jharkhand, and the actual site of the battle can be traced. The Bengal Native Infantry rode down on elephants, confronted the Santals, and then drove them through the village and across the river with great slaughter. And then there was a whole series of conflicts around the plains south of Bhagalpur, Godda, Bausi, through the monsoon of 1855. Next slide, please. So the army is confronting this rebellion, and it's doing it in 4 areas. So, number 1, the big area there, that's where the rebellion basically breaks out, and that's where the first confrontations occur. Then the one in the north, number 2, and the notable action there is a place called Pierponti on the 15th of July, where a Santal band defeats and routs, with great loss, a column from the Bhagalpur Hill Ranges. So initially, the Santals are quite successful. The third circle is around Suri, the capital of Birbhum district, where there's a whole series of confrontations through July and August. And the action of the rebellion basically drifts southwestward. So number 4 is around the southwest part of the area, north of the Grand Trunk Road, where the Santals are prevented from crossing the Grand Trunk Road. And these are large actions. You'll see at the center, there's a place called Kumarabad with a red line underneath it. Kumarabad was where Santals besieged a sepoy encampment, a fortified encampment, for about 10 days. It's an epic of a siege, a relief, of a breakout. Ultimately, the Santals are defeated, but there are major actions along the way, which nobody knows about. But I've got into the military records of the company, and I'm able to expose them. Next slide, please. The techniques that the Bengal Army used to defeat this rebellion can be seen on the screen. First of all, they used the technique of the Dua, or Dower, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, the patrol. And each regiment sends out companies of sepoys to find and to engage and to kill Santals. They also raise auxiliary troops called Bildars, some of them armed with muskets like this, some of them not very well armed, but they can move quickly, and they're able to reconnoiter and find the Santals and bring them to battle. And the Dua also involves scooping up Santal supplies and depriving them of sustenance. And that's a crucial technique to defeat the rebellion. And the top right, sepoy infantry in a field of grass, the sepoys learn and their officers learn new tactics. Next slide, please. And come to terms very quickly. They've also got a number of massive advantages. As you see here, they've got river steamers on the rivers. They've got maps and expert advice from the surveyors who know the Santal country. They've got the railway, which has just recently been opened, which transports troops and supplies. They've got civil officials who are mostly cooperative and are great repositories of intelligence. They've got the electric telegraph to transmit messages and intelligence. And they've got an established staff system which enables them to control these disparate forces. Next slide, please. And this is how the rebellion ends. The rebellion ends in 2 ways. The first way is that the Santals who have left their villages are basically starving and sick in the country of the Santal country, jungly country, in huge camps. Disease breaks out, there's starvation, and the rebellion, if you like, withers from within because they have no means of sustaining themselves. And the other way it's suppressed is that, as you see from the blue arrows, the Santal resistance basically focuses on the border between Bhagalpur district and Birbhum district. And after a hiatus, the General Lloyd in charge of the British stops operations for a couple of months, and then in late November starts a drive, as he calls it, where columns march south from Bhagalpur and Rajmahal, and they move north from Suri, and they squeeze the Santals into that area on that very rugged country on the border. And the surviving Santals who are resisting are basically either eliminated, dispersed, many of them are captured, and they go back to their villages. Next slide, please. And so the point of the story is that the Santals do actually win a victory of sorts, in that what they get is a better, more responsive, very paternal, but a more responsive British administration. So the company actually listens to the fact that the Santals have rebelled, and it takes steps to introduce a better system of government for the benefit of the Santals. Still very paternalistic. So the creation of the Santal Parganas is the result of the conflict. And I think I'd leave you with some conclusions. The first is that the Santals didn't rebel against the British. They rebelled against the mostly Bengali merchants who were oppressing them. And although it's been presented as the first resistance of the freedom struggle, I don't think it was. It was a rebellion against oppression. Contrary to popular belief, it's often represented as a slaughter. There's a quotation from a British officer who said it wasn't war, it was slaughter. Well, I don't think of course Santals were slaughtered. 10,000 Santals died, either in battle, about 2,000, or of starvation and disease, at least 8,000. But the Santals put up a very determined resistance, and although they had no martial tradition at all, they developed techniques of fighting. As I say, it collapsed from within, partly because of starvation and disease, partly because of the British strategy of squeezing the Santals. Both sides developed new tactics. The Santals from scratch. One small example, they learned that muskets took a while to reload. So they knew that when the sepoys raised their muskets and fired, they would drop to the ground and not be hit by the bullets, and then would run forward with their bows and arrows while the sepoys were reloading. So the Santals learned very quickly, but equally, the sepoys learned to fight in ways that they hadn't previously fought. They were trained to fight in long, disciplined lines. They actually adopted light infantry tactics for all of the 8 regiments that were involved. This is why I fly a flag for the Bengal Army. I don't think it was an army which was decadent and useless. It was remarkably efficient in mobilizing and then adapting to suppressing the rebellion. And I think an interesting sidelight is that of the 8 regiments that were mostly committed to the fight, that's 10% of the Bengal Army's regular infantry, 4 of those regiments did not mutiny in 1857. And I think it's because officers and men shared the experience of combat. It's often said that the British suppressed the rebellion. Well, of course, British officers, civil and military, directed the suppression, but 95% of the troops involved, of course, were Indian. And finally, the Santals, of course, could never win because they were facing an organized, powerful force which had all of those technological advantages. But the Santals, despite their break into rebellion out of a sense of frustration and rage, actually did gain something from it, in that they gained a more benign regime after the rebellion. So I'll leave you with that brief summary, brief account of the rebellion, and look forward to your questions whenever Anirudh invites you to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for an exciting presentation and sticking to time. I think we'll have 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes for some questions. We'll take questions now, because then we can then move to a different topic altogether.
Yeah, by all means.
So if somebody wants to ask a question to Peter, this is the time. Any doubts, any questions, any clarifications? Even a short comment, but keep it short and sweet. Don't convert it into another seminar paper.
And please disagree if you disagree.
Yeah, if you don't. If you feel that the Bengal Army was decadent, as he initially said, and it was within a couple of years of the Santhal revolt, the 1857 mutiny and revolt started. So if all was well in that army, why did that mutiny happen in the first place? That's a good question, I think, Peter.
Indeed.
But I mean, as the chair, I have the privilege of saying anything to you. But
Indeed. Well, go ahead.
I'd rather that somebody from the audience ask you a question. Yeah, you also. I mean, you have the right to
please,
ask
yes.
questions, of course.
Of their area and in the neighboring areas, which kind of, what is their aim there?
Yes, that's a really good question. And of course, we don't have any Santal records besides the observations of British officers and the folkloric evidence which anthropologists and missionaries gathered afterwards. I mean, there's a very rich folklore of songs and poems and stories. There is no Santal leadership, overall leadership. The three brothers of Bugnadihi are almost immediately killed or wounded in the early battles. And in any case, they don't have any authority over other Santal bands. So each Santal band appears to make its own decision. And it's very frustrating because you have to infer Santal motives from observed Santal actions. They initially moved against, I think there are two explanations. One is that they initially moved against landlords, so that, for example, from Burheit, they moved to Pakur and attacked and killed the small Raja there, because he was oppressive. They were oppressive. They also moved towards the southwest, and the southwest was where they migrated from. They actually weren't indigenous to that area. They'd migrated about 50 years before. So I think they did want to go back to their homeland, but the British formed a cordon along the Grand Trunk Road to prevent the Santals from moving. So they were, if you like, they tried to move southwestwards, they were deflected, and so they moved into country that was already devastated. So, but we just have to infer because the Santal sources are so scarce. Good question, though. Thank you. There's one there, Andrew. Yeah.
Well,
So does he. So, yeah.
Good afternoon. So I'm Commodore Durai from the Indian Navy, and I come from Mumbai from the Maritime History Society, so my interest in history.
Yeah.
I just had thank you for a very insightful talk, very interesting. I just wanted to know if you would have any insight into what background, either by caste or by group or by this thing, constituted the Bengal infantry at that time.
Yes.
Because they were taken from the local land, and then the Santals are also local. So that was just a point which struck me. Could you
yes.
throw some light?
Commodore, that's a really good question. In modern parlance, we talk about Indians. You're all Indians. But of course, in 1855, Indians came in many different varieties, and their relations were not necessarily cordial. The sepoys of the Bengal army were basically high caste Hindus recruited from the Ganges Valley and Awadh, and they felt no kinship at all with the Santals, who were a tribal people who spoke a different language, had a different religion. They were animists, not Hindus, and had also perpetrated atrocities. So the sepoys felt no sympathy at all for the people that they were directed to fight. And in fact, there are stories of sepoys killing Santals, also stories of British officers encouraging sepoys to kill Santals. So the war is conducted, the suppression of the rebellion is conducted with savagery. And it's a classic example, I think, of the imperial technique of divide and rule. The company's officers and officials were using one Indian group against another Indian group, and they felt no kinship at all. And I think that's the essence of imperialism.
I think if you really want to go into the details of the social composition of the Bengal army, the person who did pioneering work in this area is Dirk Koff.
Oh,
His
yeah.
book, Naukar Sipahi Rajput, remains a classic in this area. So he actually really dissects the Bengal army. And Dirk Koff is the person who came up with the concept of the military labor market, especially the great military labor market of North India, which is now which will now be called basically the plains of Bhojpur, which is stretches from eastern Uttar Pradesh and right up to Chhapra and Ara in Bihar. So these are the places from where, though the martial communities of that time produced the largest number of soldiers for the Bengal army. The Bengal army was called the Bengal army, as everybody knows, because it belonged to the Bengal presidency, not because Bengalis were there.
No,
in
that's
the
right.
army.
There were no
It's a-
Bengalis in the Bengal
Yeah,
army.
so let's not get confused about
Yep.
these things. Anyway, we have time for one more question because I must stick to time. Please introduce yourself. We make the question brief.
Yeah, my name is Gaurav and I'm with the USI. Do you see that the whole revolution to be a part of some kind of a dissentment going back, say 50, 40 years before the revolutions? I'm saying this because, I mean, Augusta Cleveland, the chief administrator at the Bhagalpur division, was murdered by one of the tribals called Tilka Manjhi way back in 1784. I mean, this was primarily because the tribals saw the East Indian administration working in cohort with the Paharias to replace the tribals, the Santals, from those lands. So how do you see that event where the Augusta Cleveland was killed by Tilka Manjhi and then the growing dissentment against the East Indian Company?
Yes,
Tilka
thank you.
Manjhi is a great hero, by the way.
Sir,
Tilka Manjhi
I
is a
belong
great
from
Santal hero.
I belong from the same town.
Yes,
That's why
yes.
this the question is related to my personal
Absolutely.
interest, sir.
Peter, brief
Let
answer.
me
Peter, brief
reply
answer.
very briefly. The first point is that this rebellion is only one of a pattern of rebellion against British imperialism. And there was a rebellion 30 years before, among other tribals, further to the west, which set, if you like, gave the British officers ideas of how to suppress this one. So yes, there is a pattern of rebellion. And the other point, you mentioned Paharis, there's a civil war going on at the same time as a rebellion, so that there are animosities, jealousies, and conflicts between Indian ethnic groups, which is a part of this seemingly rebellion against the company. But as you imply, it's much more complex than that, and I can't say much more for time. But thank you for putting your finger on one of the complexities of the situation. And it's never as simple as it looks in a 15-minute presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
And just to wind up your presentation, you can see the long hand of Cornwallis behind all this. Don't forget the permanent settlement of Bengal of 1793 and its long-term consequences in the Santhal regions because of the expansion of cultivation into these regions and the establishment of new zamindaris, which created the basic difference between the Dikkus and the insiders. And I think Professor Ranajit Guha's work and the several articles in the Subaltern Studies Collective
and I've
have
used
looked
and
at these things. Yes, they have actually studied this very well. So maybe as history students, we can all have a fresh look at these things. But Cornwallis, never forget him, you know. So now it's been a good session. Thank you very much, Peter, for a very interesting presentation. He deserves a big hand. And over to you, Swapna. I think we look forward to your delightful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Deshpande. And a great thanks to the USI for organizing this wonderful Festival of Military Heritage and for giving me the opportunity to speak here. And after this very interesting presentation by Peter, I'm going to talk again about the East India Company's Bengal Army and its activities a little further up the country, shall we say. So I've worked on Delhi, and Delhi particularly during the East India Company. So though my work is about, it's not about the East India Company, it's about what the people of Delhi, how they experienced the rule of the British East India Company, what they felt about it, etc. But here I thought, since we are talking specifically of revolts and rebellions, it might be a good idea to look again at occasion in which the army again plays a very important role, though a very different role from what you have just heard Peter talk about. And this is the Bengal army in revolt in 1857. And what happens in Delhi? Now, I think the basic ideas of the uprising of 1857, the whole timeline, etc., is quite well known. A little bit of background to Delhi at that time, because there are some misconceptions. Delhi actually was already had been ruled by the East India Company from 1803 onwards. The Mughal emperor was still living in the Red Fort, and he was there. And for a while, at least, they nominally ruled in the name of the Mughal emperor, but that also by 1857 had long gone. So the Mughal emperor was just sitting in the Red Fort with no powers at all, and it was the East India Company that ruled. There was some amount of army deployment in Delhi, and most of it, oddly enough, there was, for a number of years, the cantonment was bang in the center of the city. So one early place where the troops were stationed was where the St. James's Church is, near Kashmiri Gate. For those of you who know Delhi at all will know that patch of land. And that's where it was called Nasirganj. And Nasirganj was where troops were kept for a while. And then after a while, they were moved to Daryaganj. So Daryaganj became a cantonment. But shortly before the revolt broke out against the East India Company's administration, the cantonment had been built on adjoining the ridge towards the north of the city. Anyhow, 1857, the revolt breaks out in Meerut, where soldiers mutiny against their officers. They come to Delhi. And there also, one must look at this interesting phenomenon that these soldiers, which as both Anirudh and Peter pointed out, were Purabiyas. In the Hindi, in Delhi, in the popular terminology, they were all referred to as Purabiyas from the east. And they are from that eastern part of the Doab. And many of these in Meerut are also from that extraction. And they decide to come to Delhi. They come to Delhi, they arrive here the next morning. And of course, in all the soldiers who are stationed in Delhi, bit by bit join them during the course of that one day, in fact, which is the 11th of May, 1857. And what happens is that you have this outbreak of a revolt. And these soldiers come to Delhi and immediately approach the Mughal emperor saying, "We want you to lead us." And why do they want this man, Bahadur Shah Zafar, who has not had any power from the time he comes to the throne in 1837? The Mughal emperors had no power. Their jurisdiction only extended to the Red Fort over their own family. No power at all. But there is still an idea of some sort of sovereign power, that the idea that Mughals are an alternative, they are long-term rulers of large parts of India, or empire builders at any rate. So therefore, there is this, if these soldiers think that they are going to overthrow the company, in whose name are they going to overthrow it? It is not as if any Republican ideas are floating around. So they look for a symbol. So for them, the symbol is the Mughal emperor, and they do rise up in the name of the Mughal emperor and call on others of their brethren in the armed forces, in the armies, to join them. And in the coming weeks and months, you have large numbers of soldiers who begin to mutiny in cantonments and positions all over North and Central India and converge on Delhi. In fact, it's interesting that Delhi, which had a population about 1.5 lakhs, at the peak in August, probably hosted some 75 to 80,000 soldiers from outside. So that was the case. So what I'm going to really stress on is that these soldiers who come to Delhi and initially, of course, use the Mughal emperor as their head, it is very interesting to see what their ideology is. What is it that they are doing? They have to now, and in the Bengal army, Indians did not rise very high. They were not the officers. So you actually have armies now which are without their officers. They don't have that command, that they've been deprived of those higher officers. So they have to now make the decisions, they have to organize themselves, and they have to essentially run a city. Because Bahadur Shah, they have upturned the administration. So they have to fill that vacuum. And it's very interesting how they do that. Because the soldiers, and of course they take the help of, and at least the name of the Mughal emperor and the name of the various princes, etc. But really you can see that the driving force to a large extent are the soldiers themselves. And what they start doing is, first of all, they express an ideology. And that ideology is that of we Hindus and Muslims. And that we Hindu and Muslims, it's very interesting that this has also been studied by scholars like Rajat Ray, for instance, who talk about this identity. We are not talking yet about we Indians, as again Peter mentioned. There is no communality of that sort as a modern nation, but they are beginning to see of themselves as some identity which is against a foreign rule or against a colonial rule. And they do refer, the appreciation of colonialism is of course very, very incipient, but still there is this idea that we have a commonality of interest, we the Hindus and Muslims of this land, and they have very distinct grievances. And again, I will not go into the causes of the mutinies, why they had mutinied, what their grievances were. They were related to things from service conditions to what was happening to the agricultural scene. They all came from agricultural backgrounds, so what was happening to land and revenues and all those sort of things. So that was also part of their one of the many grievances they had. But they then set in place in Delhi a court of administration. That's literally what they call it, a court of administration, which is supposed to be elected from among 50% from the army and 50% from the citizens of Delhi. And this court of administration is supposed to run on the basis of a president and a vice president. And these are all, by the way, all English words that they use. So in effect, these, and they put, and elaborate rules are laid down as to how this court of administration will work, how voting on various issues will take place, the fact that the president will have a casting vote, all of these, and they will have to swear an oath of allegiance, which is basically to overthrow British rule. So it is a very interesting phenomenon that we are seeing here, which is that these soldiers who have come to Delhi, and to some extent they are also by the people of Delhi seen as outsiders, because they are, as I said, Purabiyas. They speak a language that is somewhat different. Their culture is different. So, all of that. And of course, the city of Delhi, a lot of the people also resent this fact that you have these whole large number of people here who are now demanding quarters, they are demanding food, and of course they are always looking for money to keep the war going, so they have to provide that as well. So they are not always very popular. But given these, and of course very soon what happens is that the British come and settle themselves outside the city and slowly approach the city, coming to the ridge and then slowly downwards. And it's referred to as the siege of Delhi, though of course the city is never fully besieged. But there is a sort of confrontation which leads to regular skirmishes outside the city walls, lot of shelling on gunshot fire exchanged on both sides. So it is a very, very difficult time. And at that stage, these soldiers put together what we see very interestingly is an alternative to the traditional forms of monarchy. They are putting together what they see is a sort of almost the beginnings of a democratic system of governance through electing and nominating representatives. Another thing that happens at this time, which is from a military point of view interesting, is that a large number of people who are sort of not a part of the army but are groups which arm themselves, and some of them are the laboring poor, some of them are people who may have at one time been employed in the military market that we've been talking about. These people now find the opportunity of arming themselves. And some of them are from caste groups which were not traditionally recruited into the Indian army. And, sorry. So may I just have a bottle of water, please? Sorry, thank you. So they, 5 minutes. 2 minutes, okay. So there is this interesting element of upward mobility as well, that you have people from castes which were not recruited generally to the ranks of the armies. They are also asserting themselves, and the Mughal emperor actually recognizes them by giving them a flag and drums as an identity of their status as fighting men. So here, I'm going to wind up here because I just wanted to bring out some stray ideas of how soldiers seem to be behaving in this period of crisis during the revolt of 1857. And of course, Delhi fell in September 1857 after just 4 months, and many of the soldiers, they just then left to other theaters and the revolt continued elsewhere. But I'm not going to go into that. Thank you so much.
It's a very interesting presentation, and it's open to questions. We just have time for a couple of short questions, after which we'll wind up the session.
Good afternoon, esteemed panelists. I beg your pardon for my question is not directly of the period of 1857, rather of the concept of colonialism itself, because in the New World Order, colonialism and imperialism find new definition. So my question is that with data becoming the new gold and semiconductors becoming the new oil, and with increased focus on Africa because it's rich in rare earth minerals, what are some of the lessons that we can take from the colonialism
Maybe you could ask these questions over lunch and speak with the presenters, and you might, you can talk to me also, and then maybe we'll discuss it later on,
Okay,
we teach these things in the university.
Okay,
but maybe your question is not directly related to what
yes, sir. That is why
Dr. Little
asked
has
for
just
pardon.
said. Let it be, pertinent to what she has said.
Okay,
That will
sure,
be the more proper thing to do.
Sure, sir. Sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Rana wants to ask something. Oh, please, after you. We'll have
Ma'am,
you
a
and
quick
then Rana, and then we'll.
Ma'am, a quick question. You talked about the settlements of the soldiers and the encampments in Delhi. Could you also reflect a little bit about the language that evolved from those camps? Can we say that Urdu emerged from there? Could you just...
No.
Urdu is much older, so I
Urdu
mean,
is a lot
much
older, and that whole debate about it being
yes.
Urdu as in the army, that also is very misleading. But we can talk about that later.
Urdu emerges in the 18th century. It's a much older language. So it's very well established by the time the mutiny takes place. Yeah, Rana.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and enlightening talk. A very quick question. you touched upon it very briefly, but there's a very interesting dynamic that evolves once you have these soldiers coming in and they break the etiquette of the court. They also then the Revolutionary Council finds it hugely difficult to raise the finances to maintain this army. And there are very interesting parallels between that and also what happens subsequently in East Asia when the INA is being raised by, by the India Independence League and Subhash Bose. So there are those parallels, but very quickly on the on this dynamic, because that's not something that we very often talk about because we tend to focus more on the nationalist aspects of the uprising. But there was this very, very significant undercurrent which impacted particularly the citizens of Delhi at that point in time.
Oh, yes, it's very interesting. I mean, of course, I could only talk about a few things in my presentation. And my book, a lot of it is about this, the fact that the elite of the city find these kind of social, particularly the social challenges to their entrenched authority quite threatening. And therefore, they are very reluctant at best participants in this. And most of them are not participants in the uprising against British rule. So the soldiers often do not get the kind of support that they are looking for. So
some of them survive, but many get it in the neck once the English come in. So doesn't really make much of a difference to their future.
Yeah, I mean, yes, definitely.
Can I ask, Swapna, the description you gave of the committees, it sounds almost like sort of a primitive constitutional monarchy. I mean, it sounds like St. Petersburg in 1917, to be honest.
Yes, indeed it is. It's very interesting. That document which sets out the court is a very interesting one.
Maybe after this, you can have a chat with her about this. Well, thank you very much, Sapna, for a lovely presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you to both the speakers for sticking to time. And I'm not going to behave like the usual chair in India who usually presents a third paper after the presenters have done their job. So thank you, everybody. And it's been lovely being here. Thanks, Rana, for calling us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, speakers, for an enlightening session.